When Russian forces invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, most people expected the capital city of Kyiv to fall in a matter of days. A year and a half later, and the war continues to rage on, with new casualties mounting every day. This is partially because Russia's propaganda overstated its own strength, partially because the Ukrainians proved more resilient than anyone imagined, and partially because the United States, along with other NATO countries, are supporting the Ukrainian cause and pushing their own geopolitical aspirations.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The Biden administration has spent more than $100 billion so far in supplying the Ukrainians with weapons and other supplies, most recently committing powerful US Patriot missiles to be used against the Russians. Why is our country so invested in what is essentially a territorial squabble halfway across the world? As the media tells it, it's a genuine sense of compassion and justice designed to protect, as Kamala Harris puts it,
Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia. Russia is a bigger country. Russia is a powerful country. Russia decided to invade a smaller country called Ukraine. So basically that's wrong.
In other words, a humanitarian mission, they say. But could there be other reasons why the US might want to fight a war with Russia without actually having to fight a war with Russia? Let's be clear, Vladimir Putin is a piece of shit. He jails and assassinates his political enemies, shuts down free speech, imprisons journalists he doesn't like. He's a bully and a thug who abuses his own people, as well as invading his own neighbors. But it's also true that Russia has become the catch-all boogeyman used to distract Americans from their problems at home. For his entire presidency, Democrats insisted that Russia colluded with Donald Trump to steal the 2016 election.
Russia, the Russian government, Russian military, Russian intelligence interfered in the US presidential election in 2016 to try to help Donald Trump win that election.
Many still believe it, even though an extensive series of investigations have uncovered no evidence to support the claim. The 80s are back, and this time with worse inflation. Our country's frosty history with Russia during the decades-long Cold War is still within living memory for many, making the country an ideal scapegoat for anything bad that happens in the world. The fact that Russians are the ones invading Ukraine instead of, say, the Belgians, makes it that much easier to rally support for the US involvement in the war. Mix this with a general apathy Americans have toward foreign policy after sitting back on the couch for 20+ years of uninterrupted war in the Middle East. The prevailing narrative surrounding tensions between NATO and Russia often paints a simplistic image, reminiscent of comic book betrayals of an unprovoked, power-hungry leader intent on resurrecting the Soviet Empire. However, a deeper look into the history and the events leading up to the present situation provides a more nuanced view. In 1992, during the Soviet Union's decline, Gorbachev agreed to withdraw from East Germany under the assurance from James Baker, then Secretary of State, that NATO would not expand eastward. Contrary to his promise, 5 years later, a blueprint was published by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the father of the neocons, advocating for NATO's move right to Russia's borders. This 1,000-mile eastward shift was opposed by figures like George Kennan, who saw it as a needless provocation and a red line for Russia. Instead of a peaceful approach similar to the Marshall Plan after World War II, missile systems were installed in Romania and Poland, and the US withdrew from key missile treaties.
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake. And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences. If the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve.
Further threatened by the US and the West's involvement in the Ukrainian coup of 2013 to 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and became embroiled in a conflict in eastern Ukraine. The Minsk Accords were attempts to resolve the conflict with the Ukraine, leaving Ukraine essentially autonomous.
Сегодня в Минске, безусловно, решается судьба мира и судьба Европы. Именно так
Neocons have long harbored ambitions of using Ukrainians as pawns in a proxy war against Russia, reminiscent of the Afghanistan model. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States provided the Mujahideen with weapons, training, and humanitarian support. Throughout, although the Soviets eventually withdrew, their departure led to an ongoing civil war among Afghan factions, which resulted in the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The latter carried on the September 11th attacks, prompting the US invasion of Afghanistan. And so the vicious and bloody cycle continues. The current war in Ukraine appears not to be what we've been told by the US government media propaganda machine, a mission of peace or humanitarianism, but rather a war of attrition, designed to bleed the youthful population of Ukraine and depose Putin. The objective, as candidly stated by President Biden, is to weaken Russia's global influence. However, this approach seems counterproductive, as it has arguably strengthened Putin's domestic popularity, with polls indicating an 80% approval rating. In the midst of all of this, misinformation persists, with some media outlets falsely portraying a struggling Russian military and an upper-hand Ukrainian force. Instead of working toward de-escalation, such actions and narratives risk pushing Russia closer to allies like China and prolonging a conflict where ordinary citizens bear the brunt. But this is all worth it, as some neocons like Lindsey Graham say.
And the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent.
Prior to the Cold War, proxy wars were rare. The development of the atom bomb meant that the cost of entering a hot war with another nuclear power was simply too high to be borne. But with the Soviet Union seeking to spread communism across the globe, what other options did we have? No war at all? No, that's crazy. So instead of actually entering into combat with Russia, the American government instead sponsored resistance groups in smaller countries in order to keep the communism at bay. The most famous examples of this were in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In both of these cases, these conflicts eventually escalated to the point that American soldiers were sent to fight and die, but they didn't start that way. In the beginning, the US was only sending aid from afar, as we are doing now with Ukraine. During the Cold War, in addition to Russian invasion of Afghanistan, the Chinese Civil War was one of the many proxy conflicts that saw indirect US involvement. In this particular conflict, President Harry Truman contemplated the use of Japanese soldiers to counteract the communists. The US also provided support to the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek against communist forces under Mao Zedong. While the communists eventually emerged victorious in 1949, establishing the People's Republic of China, the US-backed nationalists retreated to Taiwan, setting the stage for decades of tension across the Taiwan Strait. In case it wasn't clear, US involvement in the affairs of other countries often results in significant long-term consequences for the US. Proxy wars didn't end with the fall of the Soviet Union. According to a 2022 report from The Intercept, the US was engaged in no less than 23 proxy wars across the globe between the years 2017 to 2020. Why are proxy wars so common? There are a number of reasons. Governments funding conflicts in other countries get to pursue their international agenda without risking the lives of their own people, which in turn attracts less negative attention or resistance from the voting public. Without American boots on the ground, the media rarely focuses on the costs of the proxy wars, even when they are substantial, both in terms of taxpayer dollars and the lives of foreign soldiers. Then there's the benefit to the defense contractors and the weapons manufacturers. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower spoke about needs wars in order to perpetuate its own existence. If the government wants to send weapons overseas, it first has to buy those weapons from the likes of Lockheed or Raytheon, who then in turn offer political support to their allies in Congress. It's a vicious cycle fueled by foreign blood. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, the Biden administration doubtless sees some benefit in humbling a major global power that is not exactly friendly to US interests. They may even be hoping to use the war as a way to bring about a regime change in Russia, as it's difficult to see how Putin can maintain his position if he is unable to extract at least some concessions from Ukraine. In April of 2022, President Biden even sent Boris Johnson to pressure Zelensky to not pursue peace negotiations with Russia, even though they were close to having some sort of a deal. While the war drags on, bodies continue to pile up. Since the beginning of the war, there have been nearly 500,000 casualties, with both the Russian and Ukrainian sides bleeding heavily and no end in sight. It's natural to want to help the Ukrainian people, especially when they are underdogs facing a larger, more formidable aggressor. However, it's also crucial to examine the extensive history of US and NATO provocations toward Russia and the American government's motivations for prolonging the conflict. There's a fine line between assisting a vulnerable population and using that population as pawns in a geopolitical game, of which the American public remains largely uninformed. We must remain alert to our country's concerning history of proxy wars, often championed by the military-industrial complex for its own self-serving interests. Proxy wars rarely benefit anyone except defense contractors, and it seems Ukraine might not be an exception.